Thank you for joining us today for the Child Development Provider Accounting Reporting Information System, or CPARIS, Contract Earnings Calculations webinar. This webinar is being presented by the California Department of Education's Early Education and Nutrition Fiscal Services Unit, also known as EENFS, from the Fiscal and Administrative Services Division. This webinar is being held on January 19th, 2023, and is scheduled to run from 10 a.m. until 11:30 a.m. My name is Kate Washington. I'm a manager here in the Early Education and Nutrition Fiscal Services Unit, EENFS. I want to welcome everyone today. We're very excited to be here with you. First, some general housekeeping items before we get started. The chat box has been disabled. We'll be able to share links with you there, but you're unable to chat with us. So please utilize the Q&A feature to ask us questions. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can, and time permitting, we will also take some live questions throughout the webinar and at the end. I'm joined today by Danny Kelly, who is a lead analyst on the CPARIS project and an integral member of the team helping design and build it. Danny will be my co-presenter today. Also helping assist with answering questions behind the scenes, I have Jacob Lee, Kaya Watkins, and Kiana Slaughter, as well as Jenny Tran, who is sharing her screen today. I also have Corey Kahn and Corey Kennedy, managers here in EENFS. We're committed to answering as many questions as we can today, but if there are any we do not get to in time, please reach out to your fiscal analyst or to CPARIS support via email. And this webinar is being recorded, as the hope is to be able to post the video of the webinar to the EENFS website in the coming weeks. So on today's agenda, we're going to begin with an overview of the CPARIS system. We'll touch on common questions such as password resetting, the function of the centralized authentication system, and user roles. While we're not going to have time to go in depth on all topics, this webinar will be helpful for new or existing users of the system. And we will also be sharing resources using the chat box. Then we will spend some time discussing the certification of enrollment, attendance, and fiscal reports, as well as when these reports can be revised. We'll take a pause at the end of both the system overview and the report section of the webinar to answer questions. Next, we'll get into the main purpose of this webinar, which is a review of the all-new contract earnings calculations for CSPP contracts. We have quite a bit of ground to cover here, but we will be going step by step through the calculation itself, as well as when to expect to be able to view it in the system. And finally, we will be taking some live questions. Our team will be monitoring the Q&A, as I mentioned earlier, and so if there are questions we're seeing repeated, we will address those with everyone so that you can hear our answers. Please note that this webinar is specific to CSPP contractors. While the Department of Social Services is still using CPARIS to allow reporting for some of the contract types that have transitioned to DSS, we will not be addressing those today. Now I'm going to turn it over to Danny, who will be going over the slides pertaining to a basic review of the system and its functionality.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning, everyone. My name is Danny Kelly, and I'm an analyst here in EENFS and a lead on the CPARIS project. Today, I'll start with a system overview, reviewing with you the purpose of CPARIS, the system functions, user roles, and best practices for resetting a password. CPARIS, or the Child Development Provider Accounting Reporting Information System, is a web-based application built by the CDE. Future functions are in the process of being built, but as of today, the three main functions are viewing CSPP apportionment payment information. Payment data includes a breakdown of each payment by PCA and the date the payment was made. And contractors can view payment data going back to fiscal year 2016-17. Contractors can also use CPARIS to submit reports and requests to EENFS, including the CSPP Enrollment, Attendance, and Fiscal Report. This report includes the service county level enrollment reporting for CSPP contracts, as well as the contract level fiscal reporting. Contractors also submit fiscal reports for CPKS contracts at CPARIS. Contractors can also review previously submitted reports going back to fiscal year 2020-21. In addition, preschool reserve account activity reports can be submitted at year-end in CPARIS for contractors with the preschool reserve account. Also, contractors with both the CSPP and the CCTR contract can request or transfer funding between those two contract types through CPARIS. The next opportunity to initiate a transfer will be between April 1st and April 17th, 2023, and you can refer to the listserv sent on January 4th for more details. And now the newest feature of CPARIS, contractors can view CSPP Contract Earnings Calculations based on the data from certified CSPP reports beginning with fiscal year 2022-23. Now let's talk a little bit about how to become a user of CPARIS. Most of you are probably already familiar with the Centralized Account Authentication System, or CAS. CAS is a separate website from CPARIS. CPARIS requires the use of CAS when becoming a user of any CDE. CDE requires the use of CAS when becoming a user of any CDE established system. This is where new users of CPARIS must register their username and password. You cannot be added as a user of CPARIS until you've registered in CAS. Now, CAS is where you would go if you need to update your password, as well as if you've forgotten your password and need to reset it. If you need to update user information, such as your email address, CAS is also where you go. Note that because CAS is separate from CPARIS, CPARIS is not aware of the existence of a username until it is added as a user of CPARIS. I'll go over this in more detail in the next few slides. Before I do, note that we have dropped the link to CAS in the chat. Once you've registered a username in CAS, you must be added as a user in CPARIS before you can access the system. CPARIS users must be assigned at least one user role. A user role tells the system which functions a user may have access to. There are currently 4 user roles. The first is agency admin. These users are the primary administrators for managing CPARIS users at an agency. Although agency admin users have view-only rights to payment and report data, an agency admin user can add new users, deactivate users no longer with an agency, and to add or remove user roles for existing users. Agency admins are the only users who can view the user management tab, which is where they would go to perform these functions. There's also authorized representatives. These users can view payment information, enter report data, and they are the only users allowed to certify a report as accurate and complete, thereby submitting it to the CDE. There are also data entry representatives. These users can view payment information and are also allowed to create enrollment, attendance, and fiscal reports. They can enter data in all sections of the report, however, they cannot certify the report. Finally, agency staff users can view payment information and report data, but they cannot enter report data or certify reports. At least one agency admin user is required, but more than one is highly encouraged. A user of CPARIS can have more than one user role assigned. For example, an agency admin user can also be an authorized representative, but the requirement is that at least one user role is assigned to each user. When new users are added or reactivated if they already existed, the default user role is agency staff. So keep in mind that if you accidentally deactivate a user and reactivate them, you will need to add roles again. Also note that when roles are added to a user who is currently logged in, they will be required to log out and back in before they can access the new rights. For example, if the agency admin user role is added to a user who is currently only an authorized representative, that user will not see the user management tab until they log out and back in. And speaking of that, let's walk through what agency admin users have available on the user management tab. On this slide, we're looking at the user management tab, which is only visible to agency admin users. Once the agency admin user logs into CPARIS, there will be 5 tabs at the top of the screen, with the last tab being the user management tab. The user management tab will show a list of all active and inactive users at your agency. This tab will display all users, active or inactive. From left to right, the username, name, email address, currently assigned user roles, user status, and an update status column. Agency admin users can take a few actions on this screen. First, by clicking on a blue hyperlinked username, you will open a screen where the agency admin can review, remove, or assign new user roles for that user. Second, in the update status column, the agency admin user can either activate or deactivate a user. Note that the difference between the status and the update status column. In the example on this slide, there are 3 users at this agency that are active. Clicking on Inactivate in the Update Status column will inactivate the user. Third, this screen is where the agency admin users can add a new user for the agency. Now, let's say you've hired a new employee who now needs access to CPARIS. To add this new user, after the employee has registered in CAS, the agency admin will go to the User Management tab, enter the CAS username in the Add a User box, located to the right of the screen, and click Search. If the user has not successfully registered in CAS, or if the username was mistyped by the agency admin, an error message will display stating that the username could not be found. Provided the username is registered and typed correctly, clicking Search will take you to a screen where you can verify the user's information, such as the email address and as they entered it in CAS. Clicking that Search button will take the user to this screen, where the agency admin user can confirm the information before adding the user. The agency admin user should verify the new user's username and user information, such as the user's stated email and phone number. If you've gotten to this point and realize you do not want to add this user, you can click Cancel button, and that will stop the process. Once the information is verified, clicking Save here will take the agency admin user to the next screen where they can assign user roles. Once you have successfully added a user, a new screen will appear where a notification will appear that the user has been added. As I mentioned earlier, the default user role when new users are added or when users are reactivated is the view-only agency staff role. Clicking Save on this screen without selecting any other user role will mean that this user will have view-only rights. The agency admin will designate the appropriate user roles by checking the active box next to the specific user role. Remember, the user roles are agency admin, agency staff, data entry representative, and authorized representative. We just covered the different user roles in a previous slide, but note that the agency admin will also find a description of the roles of each user type at this approval step under the description column. If you wish to make this user a data entry representative, for example, checking the data entry representative box and clicking the Save button will activate that user role. Remember, if you add a role to a user currently logged into CPARIS, they will need to log out of the system and back in before they can see their new rights. Remember how we saw the list of all agency user roles on the first user management slide? This screen is the same one that will appear when an agency admin user clicks on a username from that screen. And this is what will allow the agency admin user to add or remove user roles. Now let's talk about a hot topic, password reset. CPARIS support cannot reset a password. There are a couple ways for a user to reset a password, but the first thing to remember is that passwords are updated not in CPARIS, but in CAS. Users can get to CAS from the CPARIS logon screen, a sample of which is on this slide. Below the username and password boxes, there are 3 links to CAS: Update, New Registration, and Forgot Password. The Update link will allow users to log into CAS, provided they know their current password. Once logging into CAS, they will see a screen where they can click on a link to update their password. The Forgot Password link will take the user to CAS, where they will be required to enter their username, email address, and answer a security question. I'll briefly take you through those 2 options in CAS. First, let's go through the process to update your password. Keep in mind, passwords expire every 90 days. In order to be able to successfully update your password, you must know your most recent password. You can update an expired password, but it must be the most recent password. To navigate to this screen, a user must click Update from the CPARIS logon screen, log into CAS, and then this screen will appear. If the user clicks on the Update Password link on this screen, they will be able to enter a new password. Provided the password meets the minimum password requirement, a confirmation of successful password reset will appear at the top of the screen. Once the password has been reset, a user should be able to log into CPARIS with that updated password. On this page, there is also a link called Update Personal Information. Before we go into resetting a forgotten password, let's discuss how to update information such as your name, email address, or even your selected security questions. Users wishing to update their information must log into CAS and click on the Update Personal Information link. Clicking on the Update Personal Information link will take the user to a page in CAS. On that screen, the user can update information such as their first and last name, phone number, and email address. The user can also select different security questions and type new answers to the questions already selected. Now let's talk about the process for resetting a forgotten password. To reset, enter the username and email address and select one of the two security questions that were chosen when the username was established in CAS. The security question field is a dropdown where all possible security questions are listed. CAS will not populate the questions you chose when you initially established your username, so you must remember at least one. For security reasons, CPARIS support does not have access to your security questions. If for some reason you don't remember your security questions or answers, CAS will not lock you out for going through the list and continuing to guess the correct combination. Provided you are able to enter the information correctly, you will receive a message that an email has been sent to your email address. The email will contain a long alphanumeric temporary user ID. Select the Go To link in the email. The link will take you back to CAS, where you must enter the temporary user ID and create a new password. Provided you meet the password requirement, you will see confirmation of successful password reset at the top of that screen. At that point, you can log on with your username and newly reset password. Let's spend some time talking about password requirements and best practices for resetting forgotten passwords. The number one most important thing to remember is that you should ensure you are resetting the password for your active username. An active username is a username that has been added as a user in CPARIS and is active. Any agency admin user can tell you what your active username is. Remember, the User Management tab displays that information. When you register your username, please keep your security questions and answers written down or saved in a secure place. If you are unable to update your password, that is, enter the current password and set up a new password, the only way to reset your password is to select and answer at least one security question you set up when you registered. Remember, CAS does not populate the questions you chose, so you must remember which ones you selected or guess correctly. We talked about the need for a username to be added as a user with the user role assigned in order to be able to log into CPARIS. You will get the same error message if you enter an incorrect password when you try to log in with a username that is not an added user of CPARIS. This can cause confusion, so please make sure you are aware of your active username before trying to reset your password. The only time you should register for a new username is when you have tried all steps to reset the password and that you are unable to do so. If you choose to register a new username, know that the new username will also have to be added as a user before you can use it to log in. Passwords must meet the following criteria in order to be accepted. It must be at least 8 characters. It must contain at least one uppercase letter and one lowercase letter. It must contain one number and one special character. Before I move on to the next section of the webinar, I want to note that EENFS created a CPARIS frequently asked questions document that is posted to our site. There are specific instructions in the FAQs that list the steps for updating user information, updating passwords, and also for resetting a forgotten password. We'll drop the link to the FAQs in the chat now. Now I'd like to pause here to see if there are any questions we're seeing in the Q&A that need to be addressed live.
Thank you, Danny. So there are just a few that I want to address live that keep coming up. So the first one, I don't know, Kate or Danny, if you want to take it, but we're getting a lot of questions on whether this webinar will be shared. So can you just repeat what we plan to do?
So we are recording this webinar. We are not going to be posting the slides, but the recording of the webinar is hopefully going to be posted here in the next few weeks. So you can look for that on the ENFS webpage, and we will be also posting a link to that webpage towards the end of the webinar.
Okay, thank you. Just for everyone's knowledge too, we have to make sure that whatever we post is accessible and compliant. So that's some of the reason for a couple-week delay, but we're hoping to post the webinar as soon as possible. The second question, Danny, is can you explain again just briefly what CAS is? And explain just briefly the difference between, or the interaction, I guess, between CAS and CPARIS.
CAS is the centralized authentication system, and it's something that a few different systems are built on, I believe. CPARIS is definitely built on top of it, and it's basically where you will set up your username, but you can access it through the CPARIS link. So you don't have to find CAS independently. You can just go to CPARIS and click, I believe there's a create new username, and that will take you to CAS where you can establish your username.
So CAS, in a nutshell, is where you establish your username that you will then use to log into CPARIS.
Correct.
And then CAS is also where you would go to update information as well. So let's say your email address changes, which we know happens. So you would go into CAS to actually update your information. And so that would require you to go into CAS, excuse me, log in. And there's a section to update your information where you can update email address, you can update your name, things of that nature. And that's also covered in the FAQs, which I will drop the link to in the chat right now.
But I just want to restate that while CAS is a separate system, you don't have to find a separate link to get to what you need for CPARIS. Any interaction you need for CAS or for CPARIS through CAS, you can get to through the CPARIS website.
Okay, and then the last question that we received, and I'm just going to read what the question was, and hopefully you guys can answer it. But who has access to CAS, and how can you get an ID and user? Is this for admins or program directors only, or can office staff have an account?
So anyone at your agency can have access to CPARIS if they choose to have access. CAS is open to anyone. Anyone can register for a username using CAS. The only thing that you need to remember is that it's a two-step process. So registration in CAS with a username and a password does not mean that you immediately have access to CPARIS. And that is where I think some of the confusion lies. Once you register a username in CAS, any agency user at your agency with agency admin role can add that person, and they must add that person before that person can actually access CPARIS. And so they would then assign any necessary user roles. And there is a view only role. So if you have someone in your agency that you just want to be able to view the information in CPARIS, but not actually enter any report information, there is a view only role that's associated with that as well that Danny went over earlier.
Those were all the questions that I had thus far.
Okay. Now moving on to the reporting section of the system, let's discuss what can be found under the fourth tab, which is the reporting tab. CPARIS allows users to interact with reports in various ways. Under current forms, forms that are currently required of your agency will be viewable. For example, a contractor on clear status is not required to submit monthly reports. And so the first 2022-23 report that will be viewable here would be the September report due in October. Just a note, typically we shoot for having reports available by the first of the following month, October 1st for September reports in this example. Under all report forms, the contractors can find any reports they may submit for the current period. Using the earlier example of a contractor only required to report quarterly, should the contractor choose to report monthly, the All Report Forms section is where they would find the July and August reports as they become available. Once a report form has been saved to a draft status and has not yet been certified, it becomes available in the Certification Preview section. This is where authorized representatives can go to review reports prior to certification. Under the Certified Data section, authorized reps can view report data as well as certify one or more reports. Finally, the Certified Reports listing, as the name implies, is where users can view previously certified reports. Users can also view the status of their reports, which I'll get into in the next few slides. Those of you who have been users of the system for some time will remember pre-January 2022, the CSPP enrollment, attendance, and fiscal reports were on one page. Provided there were no errors, saving the report would allow it to be certified. Beginning in January 2022, when service county level enrollment reporting was implemented, reports now contain 3 tabs: the Enrollment and Attendance tab, the Fiscal tab, and the Finalized Calculations tab. All contractors, even those serving in only one county, will see the 3 tabs. In order for the system to allow the report to be certified, each tab must be saved in order. This is because the data flows from one tab to the next. The Save button can be found by scrolling down to the bottom of each section. Contractors with more than one service county must save each county tab in the Enrollment and Attendance section in order, then save the Fiscal tab, and then save the Finalized Calculations tab. So in this example, this contractor would need to save the Enrollment and Attendance data in the San Benito tab and then the Santa Clara tab, before moving on to saving data in the Fiscal and Finalized Calculations tab. Before we get into how to certify reports, let's take a moment to talk about report statuses. Once a report has been created and saved, CPARIS will assign a status to that report. First, incomplete status indicates a report has been created and saved, but all tabs have not been saved in sequential order. This tells the user that while there is a report that has been created for certification, it cannot be certified due to the status. Once all data has been reviewed and saved in order, the status of the report will change to draft. At that point, any authorized representative must certify the report in order for it to be considered submitted to CDE. Reports in certified status have been certified by the authorized representative. And last, reports in certified obsolete status indicate the data that flows into this report has been changed since the report was certified. Reports in this status will remain as certified obsolete until the authorized representative reviews and recertifies the report. We will go into more detail about that in a moment. Report statuses can be viewed in a few places in CPARIS. Under Current Forms, if it is a currently required report, under All Report Forms in the Certified Data screen, and finally in the Certified Reports screen. One thing to note, if a report is created but never certified, once the period closes, that report will not be visible unless it is reopened by CDE. We'll talk more about report reopening shortly. Once a report has been successfully saved in draft status, it is available to be certified. As we talked about earlier, CPARIS allows for multiple users at an agency with any combination of user roles. The user role specific to report certifying is authorized representative. Authorized representatives can certify reports by navigating to the reporting tab and selecting certified data. Going from left to right, the certified data page includes the following information: the fiscal year of the agreement, the title of the report, which is a hyperlink that will take the user to the report deadline, the report status, the username of the last user to save the report, and the date and time it was saved, and a checkbox to certify reports that are ready to be certified. This slide provides an example of a September report that needs to be certified, which is indicated as draft status. Remember, draft status means that the report has been saved and is ready for certification. On this screen, the authorized user can view the username of the person that saved the latest version of the report and the date and time it was saved. Of course, users that are certifying reports are certifying their accuracy, so the report should be reviewed prior to certification. Earlier, we mentioned that the certification preview section in the reporting tab. An authorized representative can go there to view the report prior to certification or from this screen. They can click on the blue hyperlinked reporting form. To certify this report, the authorized representative would click the Certify checkbox and click Certify Submissions, located at the bottom of the table. CPARIS will allow users to certify multiple reports at once. So if there is more than one report to certify, you can click multiple Certify checkboxes and then the Certify Submissions button. Now let's talk about how to revise a previously certified report. When revisions to previously certified reports are necessary, report revisions must be made in the relevant month. For example, a contractor wishing to change data reported in September must revise the September report. If a report is revised, it must be recertified in order to be considered submitted to CDE. Reports that are revised but not recertified will not be considered complete, and the data from that report will not be included in the contract earnings calculation. Going from left to right, the certified reports listing includes the following information: the fiscal year of the agreement, the title of the certified report, which is a hyperlink that will take the user to the report, the report status, the username of the authorized representative who certified the report and the date and time it was certified, a link to the earnings calculation, the report period status, and a link to edit the report. The only reports with report period status of only reports with a report period status of open can be revised. The status of a report can be viewed at any time by navigating to the certified reports listing in the reporting tab. In the report period status column, reports with the status of open can be edited by clicking on the edit report link. Reports that are closed must be reopened by the CPARIS team. If you wish to revise a report that is closed, you must contact your fiscal analyst for assistance with that request. I'd like to note here that the certified reports listing can get fairly lengthy, particularly for those contractors that submit monthly reports or who have more than one contract type. There are filters at the top of the page that can be utilized to make navigation easier, such as fiscal year or agreement type. When revising reports, users should keep in mind the data flows from one period to the next. Therefore, if a report has been revised and recertified, any subsequent report that has been previously certified will become certified obsolete, since the subsequent reports use data that has been updated. Using the earlier example of a quarterly report, let's say an agency certified September, December, and March reports, and then realizes an edit needs to be made to the September report. Once the agency edits and recertifies the September report, the previously certified December and March reports will show a status of certified obsolete. That status means that the data in the previously certified report has changed, requiring a review and recertification. Let's say the change in September was a change to the certified days of enrollment, adding 10 days of enrollment to the exceptional needs full-time category. In the revised September report, the total days of enrollment and adjusted days of enrollment will now be higher, and the report must be recertified. The data from that certified report will become the cumulative prior period data in the December report, which must now be recertified, and then March must be recertified as well. Now that we've reviewed report certification, I'll hand it back to Kate to review the contract earnings calculations.
Thank you, Danny. I'd like to pause here to see if there are any questions we're seeing in the questions and answers that need to be addressed live.
I have a few.
Okay. Thank you, Corey.
Okay. Let's see. We have 2 centers, same county. Do you submit 2 reports or 1?
No, you would submit just Oh, go ahead. Go ahead,
I was
Danny.
going to say, go ahead, Kate, but here I go. You would submit one report per county or one report per county tab. So you would just aggregate the total enrollment data for the county that you're reporting in and put that into the county tab.
Yeah. So what
I don't
and I
believe this is
will-
actually a change.
So I will go a little bit further in the sense that the reports that you submit through CPARIS are specific to the contract. So if you only have one CSPP contract, you are only submitting one report that would aggregate all of your child days of enrollment and fiscal information for that contract. What Danny went over was if you serve in multiple counties, you will then see within your one CPARIS enrollment, attendance, and fiscal report, you will see multiple tabs that would be specific to the county. So you would then report your enrollment data by county, but still only within one report. So the reports are really specific to whether you have one CSPP contract or not. Okay, the next question is, who would I request to remove a county from my report? So I guess in this scenario, there is a tab that says they serve in a county that they actually don't provide service in. So how did they go about fixing that?
I'll answer that one.
Oh, go ahead.
The short answer is you would reach out to your fiscal analyst. However, there's a little bit of a caveat where if you served in a county earlier in the year and you stop serving in that county in the course of the year, you would still need to have the tab for that county for the rest of that service year. And you would just continue to certify 0 enrollment data in that for the subsequent months. And that is because we need to carry forward the prior period enrollment information that was certified in that county.
Okay, I'll call on Kate for this one. There were a few questions about like an easier way to print a report that has been submitted through CPARIS. I think right now people are screenshotting each tab or whatever fits on their screen. So one of the questions was, would CPARIS be updated to do something like a print to PDF so that it would save nicely?
There is a print to PDF option, and that's just screen printing from the actual web page. The only thing that is a little time consuming that we do understand, it can be time consuming, is the tabs. So you do still have to print each tab individually. And that's something that with enough resources, we would love to be able to update, but at this point, we don't have plans to make that change. So your best option is to print to PDF from that web page.
That was all the questions I had so far.
Okay, now let's talk about the contract earnings calculation process. As contractors certify enrollment, attendance, and fiscal reports in CPARIS, they become viewable to your fiscal analyst, who will review that report for completion and accuracy. Provided there are no issues with the report, the analyst will approve it, which will generate the contract earnings calculation based on the report data, making it viewable to contractors in CPARIS. And I know I saw that question earlier and I did answer that. So that is what makes it viewable to you. Your analyst has to review that and approve it. So as the graphic on this slide suggests, this is a continuous process, meaning that each time your agency certifies a report, it must be reviewed and approved by your analyst, and a new earnings calculation will become viewable based on that report. If your agency revises a report, a revised earnings calculation will be generated from that report. At this time, as with certified reports, only the most recent version will be viewable in the system. So for example, if your agency revised a previously certified September report, your fiscal analyst approved that report and a new earnings calculation was generated, the previous September earnings calculation would no longer be viewable. You can always do a print to PDF as those are approved, and you can save those on your side if that is something that you would like to do in the meantime while we're working on that functionality. To view your agency's earnings calculations, any CPARIS user can navigate to the certified reports listing that Danny talked about earlier. And this screen will list all reports that have been certified. And again, remember, you can filter by fiscal year, which is especially helpful if you see a long list of reports. You'll see the contract and report month there under the certified reports column. To view the specific earnings calculation for a particular report month, you'll click on the view link in the earnings calculations column. And next, we'll view the earnings calculation for this contract, CSPP 2999, the earnings calculation based on the September enrollment, attendance, and fiscal report in this example. In the next few slides, we'll go over each section of the calculation. And you'll learn as I go through this next section of our webinar that contract earnings calculations are a combination of contract terms, data from the enrollment, attendance, and fiscal reports, and system calculations. At the top of the contract earnings calculation screen, the contractor name and the contract number will be present. Directly below the agency and contract information, the fiscal analyst's name, date, and time the calculation was approved by the analyst will appear. Next, the report month, the name of the authorized representative who certified the report, as well as the date and time it was certified. The apportionment month this calculation will impact, and the amendment and revision number the earnings calculation is based upon. In this example, the report month is September. The apportionment month this calculation will impact is December, and contract terms are based on amendment number 01. And we'll see how that impacts the calculation in the next section. So the first section of the earnings calculation is the contract terms section. At the top of the screen, the maximum reimbursable amount, or MRA, is displayed. In this example, the MRA is $5 million. We know from the previous slide that this calculation is pulling in terms from the contract's 01 amendment. Next, the apportionments paid to date. This is the total amount of payments that have been made to this contract, which in this example is 1.5 million. And the minimum days of operation, or MDO, are also a term of the contract that will come from the 01 amendment. That's 241 in this example. And this contract also has an approved startup amount of $30,000. The voluntary temporary transfer, or VTT, and CSPP CCTR transfer exception is an adjustment that impacts two items in the calculation. VTTs are transfers between one contractor's under-earning contract to another contractor's over-earning contract. The transfer is temporary or only for one fiscal year. And CSPP CCTR transfers are transfers between one contractor's CSPP and CCTR contract. Contractors with a preschool reserve account are limited to a maximum reserve of 15% of the total of their CSPP MRAs. The exception line is listed here to prevent that temporary increase or decrease to a contractor's MRA from impacting their preschool reserve account cap or their total exceptional needs severely disabled set aside. So let's use the example of an under-earning contractor participating in a VTT. That contractor's MRA will decrease due to temporarily giving up funds to another contractor. That decrease cannot impact the total amount of preschool reserve funds this contractor is allowed to hold. In our example here, the contract decreased by $100,000 due to participating in one or both of those transfers. So the amount displayed here is a positive that will impact the calculation of the preschool reserve account cap and the exceptional needs severely disabled set aside. And in the opposite case, if a contract increased due to a transfer, they would see a negative amount here, preventing their preschool reserve account cap and the exceptional needs severely disabled set aside from increasing due to temporarily receiving funds from another contractor or from another contract. And finally, the calculation for the contract's exceptional needs severely disabled set aside. Education Code Section 8205AE defines funded enrollment as the number of subsidized children funded to be enrolled based on the MRA contract rate, inclusive of any adjustment factors and approved program calendar by a CSPP contractor. Pursuant to Education Code Section 8208C1, in fiscal year 22-23, CSPP contractors are required to set aside 5% of funded enrollment for children with exceptional needs, as defined in Education Code Section 8205. The set-aside amount will increase to 7.5% in fiscal year 23-24 and to 10% in fiscal year 24-25. So on this line, you'll see the calculation is taking the total MRA of $5 million and adding in the VTT exception, which can be either a negative or a positive, multiplying the result by 5% to represent 5% funded enrollment, and multiplying by 2.4, which is the full-time exceptional needs adjustment factor. And in this example, that gives the contractor a total exceptional needs severely disabled set aside of $612,000. The next section of the report is titled Calculations from Reported Data, which is where the projection factor calculation and the certified enrollment percentage are located. First, let's review the projection factor, which is a calculation used to estimate the year-end service earnings and reimbursable costs of a preschool program. To determine the projection factor, CPARIS will take the contract MDO, which you may remember from a few slides ago is 241 in our example, and divide that by the actual days of operation reported. So in the example we're using, the agency has reported 58 days of operation in their September report, which gives us a projection factor of 4.1552. And remember that number because we will see the projection factor used throughout the earnings calculation. Now let's talk about the certified enrollment percentage. Remember, in the report submitted to CDE, unadjusted days of enrollment are reported in specific categories, which are then multiplied against adjustment factors to arrive at adjusted days of enrollment. In this section of the earnings calculation, CPARIS will display the total certified adjusted days of enrollment. This number will be the total from all categories and all service counties. In this example, the total certified adjusted days of enrollment is 10,000.45. The next line is the total certified adjusted severely disabled exceptional needs days of enrollment. That comes from enrollment reported in the severely disabled and exceptional needs categories. In this example, the total certified adjusted days of enrollment reported in the severely disabled and exceptional needs reporting categories are 500.85. And please note that the 500.85 is not in addition to the total certified adjusted days of enrollment of 10,000.45. The severely disabled exceptional needs enrollment is already part of that 10,000.45 total certified adjusted days of enrollment. Next, the total non-certified adjusted days of enrollment will be identified. In this example, it is 1395. Now we put all of that together to determine the percentage of certified enrollment. The system does this by dividing the total certified adjusted days of enrollment by the total adjusted days of enrollment, both certified and non-certified. For the example we're using, the total certified and non-certified enrollment is 11,395.45. 10,000.45 divided by 11,395.45 will give us a percent certified days of enrollment for this example of 87.7583%. Now, although contract reimbursement is based on the lesser of the contract MRA or the net reimbursable costs in fiscal year 22-23, the flex factor will still be reflected on the earnings calculation. Pursuant to California Code of Regulations, Title V, Section 17812, in a non-hold harmless year, the third limit of reimbursement is typically determined by multiplying the adjusted days of enrollment for certified children by the contract rate by the actual percentage of attendance plus 5%, but in no case to exceed 100% of enrollment. And the addition of the 5% as referenced in Title V is referred to as the 5% flex factor, and it is applied as an allowance which is added to the actual percentage of attendance. So for this example, the total attendance percentage is based on reported data is 94%, and that 94% is determined by taking the total days of attendance from all counties from the report and dividing that by the total certified days of enrollment. On the total attendance percentage with flex factor line, this contract's total attendance percentage is 99%, which is determined by adding that 5% flex factor to their actual attendance percentage of 94%. Now let's go to the next section, the expense calculations. First, the total expenses are displayed, and that number reflects the cumulative total expenses reported to date, $1,625,000 in our example. This contractor has reported $60,000 in restricted income, as well as a transfer from their preschool reserve account of $1,000. Now, the first calculation in this section is the net expenses, and that is determined by taking the total expenses, remember that $1,625,000, and subtracting out the restricted income and transfer from the preschool reserve account. The net expenses in our example are $1,564,000. Continuing within the expense calculation section are the administrative expenses, startup, and staff training expenses. First, the contractor has reported a total of $235,000 in administrative expenses in our example. CPARIS will calculate the maximum admin expenses allowed, which is done by taking the net expenses and multiplying by 15% pursuant to Education Code Section 8258. Now, remember from the previous slide, the net expenses were $1,564,000. Multiplying that number by 15% gives us our maximum administrative expenses allowed of $234,600. Now, the system will compare what the contractor has reported in admin expenses to the maximum allowable. If the amount of admin expenses being reported is at or below the maximum amount, the calculation will show a 0 here. In our example, however, the contractor is reporting $400 more than what is allowable for the reported expenses to this contract. The last two items on this slide are the startup expenses and the staff training expenses. Both of these come from reported data. In our example, the contractor has reported $10,000 in startup expenses and $5,000 in staff training expenses. And on the next slide, we'll see how that comes into play in the calculation. So our final expense calculation slide shows the net adjusted and projected expenses for this contract. All three lines displayed here are calculations based on the data we just reviewed. So first, the net adjusted expenses are calculated by taking the net expenses and subtracting the excess admin, the startup, and the staff training expenses. Our net expenses were $1,564,000. Remember, we had $400 in excess admin, $10,000 in reported startup, and $5,000 in staff training expenses. And so the end result is $1,548,600. Startup and staff training expenses are typically one-time expenses and should not be considered as part of the projection, which is why you'll see that they're subtracted here and they will be added in later. Next, we'll see the calculation for net adjusted reimbursable expenses. Here, CPARIS is taking the amount it just determined to be the adjusted net expenses and multiplying that by the % certified days of enrollment. That was a few slides back, so to refresh your memory, that number was 87.753%, which makes the net adjusted reimbursable expenses in this example $1,359,025. Now that the net adjusted reimbursable expenses have been determined, CPARIS will determine the projected fiscal year net adjusted reimbursable expenses. And to do this, the net adjusted reimbursable expenses are multiplied by the projection factor, and then we will see the startup and staff training expenses are added back in. And finally, the transfer from the preschool reserve account is subtracted. So in our example, that gives us a total of $5,660,982. And that is the amount CPARIS has determined to be the projected fiscal year reimbursable expenses for this contract. And now we'll go into the county service earnings section of the earnings calculation. Remember, enrollment has been reported by service counties since January 2022. However, with the previous calculation worksheets that were received by your fiscal analyst via email, service earnings were not displayed at the county level. CPARIS earnings calculations now will show the service earnings by county. Contractors that serve in more than one county will see a section on the earnings calculation for each county. First, the earnings calculation will display 3 county enrollment totals. This will look familiar if the display mimics the layout above in the calculation for the certified enrollment percentage. However, here the information is at the county level. So we have the county total certified adjusted days of enrollment, the county total certified adjusted days of enrollment specifically related to exceptional needs and severely disabled categories, which is included in that first total. And finally, the county total non-certified adjusted days of enrollment. Now let's look at the second half of the county service earnings section. First, the applicable service county rate will be displayed. The rates displayed here correspond to the fiscal year 22-23 California State Preschool reimbursement rates by service county. Now, CPARIS will calculate actual and projected service earnings using the enrollment data and service county rate. First, the actual county service earnings are determined by taking the county's total certified adjusted days of enrollment, the number we saw on the previous slide, which was 10,000.45 in our example, and multiplying that by the service county rate. That gives us a total of 872,239 here in our example, and that amount represents the service earnings to date. Next, the portion of that amount related to the exceptional needs severely disabled set aside is determined by using the subset of the total adjusted days of enrollment that was related to the exceptional needs severely disabled categories we saw on the previous slide. That enrollment is also multiplied by the service county rate to determine the total of 43,684 related to those categories. And the same as the enrollment section, that calculation is not in addition to the total service county earnings determined on the line above. The system is simply determining how much of that amount is related to the exceptional needs severely disabled categories. Now, the earnings calculation will take those two numbers and project for the fiscal year. The projected fiscal year service earnings are determined by taking the actual service county earnings, 872,239 in our example, and multiplying by the projection factor of 4.1552 that we calculated a few slides ago. That gives us the total of 3,624,304. So based on the enrollment data reported by this contractor, CPARIS is projecting that amount will represent their service earnings in this county. The same calculation is performed to determine of that amount the projected fiscal year county exceptional needs severely disabled service earnings. So the system is taking 43,684 and multiplying by the projection factor to arrive at the total of 181,515, which represents this county's service earnings specifically related to the exceptional needs and severely disabled categories. Now we'll talk about the calculation to determine the exceptional needs severely disabled service level exemption. A few slides ago, we went over the contract terms section of the earnings calculation. That is one of the first items you'll see on the contract earnings calculation. For example, we took the MRA of $5 million, added the VTT and CSPP CCTR transfer exception of $100,000, multiplied that by 5% and then by 2.4, which equals the total amount set aside to serve children with exceptional needs or severe disabilities. In this example, for this contract, that amount is $612,000. So remember on the previous slide, we walked through how CPARIS performed the calculation to project the total service earnings for the fiscal year related specifically to enrollment in the exceptional needs and severely disabled categories. And that number was 181,515 in our example. So on the second line here, the total exceptional needs and severely disabled service level exemption credit is calculated. To do so, CPARIS will subtract the total projected service earnings for those categories, the 181,515, and it will subtract that from the total set aside of $612,000. And that will bring us to the service level exemption credit for this contract of $430,485. And we'll discuss how that credit is added to subsequent sections of the calculation. So now we're going to review the contract earnings summary section of the earnings calculation. The summary will tie all of the calculations together, so some information is repeated from earlier sections of the calculation. At the top of the summary, CPARIS will display the contract MRA again. This is one limit of reimbursement of the contract that will be compared against on a later line of the summary. Next, we will again see the projected fiscal year net adjusted reimbursable expenses with the exceptional needs severely disabled service level exemption credit added in. And remember in our example, CPARIS determined the projected fiscal year net adjusted reimbursable expenses for this contract was $5,660,982. And that amount was determined by multiplying the net adjusted reimbursable expenses by the projection factor, adding in startup and staff training expenses, and subtracting any transfer from the preschool reserve account. So in our example, the total projected expenses with the exceptional needs severely disabled service level exemption credit added in will be $6,091,467. So that's the $5,660,982 plus the service level exemption credit of $430,485. So continuing through the summary section related to projected service earnings, first we have another repeat of earlier lines, the total attendance percentage and the total attendance percentage with flex factor. So remember in our example, this contractor had a total attendance percentage of 94%, and with the flex factor added, that increased the total attendance percentage to 99%. And now we'll see how that impacts the service earnings calculation for this contract. So next we have the total projected fiscal year service earnings. How is this different from the service earnings we saw earlier? Well, this amount represents the sum of projected service earnings across all service counties. So if you are a contractor serving in more than one county, the amount here will be the total of all of those counties. So in our example, this contractor serves only in one county, and the amount here is the same as earlier, $3,624,304. And now CPARIS will take that amount and multiply that against the attendance percentage with flex factor, 99% in our example, reducing service earnings based on attendance before adding in the exceptional needs severely disabled service level exemption credit. And that gives us the total projected service earnings adjusted for attendance with the service level exemption credit added of $4,018,546. So the last line we'll look at here is the projected fiscal year contract earnings. And here is where CPARIS would normally pull in the lesser of service or cost earnings. However, in this hold harmless year, the amount reflected here will be the projected expenses plus the exceptional needs severely disabled service level exemption credit. And that amount is $6,091,467. We're down to the last two calculation slides. So this is the section of the summary where the projected contract reimbursement is determined. First, CPARIS will bring in any reported interest earned on apportionment payments, that's $20 in our example, and project that for the year by multiplying it by the projection factor of 4.1552, giving us the projected interest of $83. Now, the projected fiscal year adjusted contract earnings are determined by taking the amount calculated earlier, the $6,091,467, and subtracting projected interest on apportionment payments, giving us the amount of $6,091,384. And the projected fiscal year reimbursement line is taking the lesser of that projected adjusted contract earnings amount and the contract MRA. And we know from the first line of the summary that the example MRA is $5 million, and that is what is displayed here, as the projected expenses are higher than the contract MRA, and therefore the agency's earnings are limited to their MRA. And finally, we have the projected percentage of contract earnings. Of course, we know this agency is projected to fully earn their contract, and therefore the projected percentage is 100%. Now, again, remember, this is based on data submitted on the report at a point in time. As reports are submitted, subsequent earnings calculations may change the projected earnings and apportionment. And now finally, all the calculations that have been performed so far lead to this part of the summary, the calculated apportionment. I'm repeating a couple of lines here on my slide to illustrate my example, the projected fiscal year reimbursement and the projected percentage of contract earnings. And the third line displayed here is the apportionments paid to date. The amount in our example is $1.5 million. Next, the apportionment schedule cumulative percent is displayed. That percentage will correspond to the apportionment month of the report and the apportionment schedule. The apportionment schedule can be found in the EENFS fiscal handbook, and we'll drop a link to that in the chat shortly. One of the first slides we looked at showed us our example was a September report that would generate data for a December apportionment. And so the December apportionment schedule percentage is 50%. And what that means is that while we are projecting earnings for the entire fiscal year, we will be advancing funding for 50% of those earnings to make payment for services through December. And our last line is the calculated apportionment. And that amount is determined by taking the projected fiscal year reimbursement, multiplying it by the apportionment percentage, and subtracting out any apportionments paid to date. $5 million multiplied by 50% minus 1.5 million brings us to the calculated apportionment of $1 million. And now I'd like to pause here to see if there are any questions we're seeing in the Q&A that need to be addressed live.
There's a lot of questions and we're trying to get to a lot of them.
I thought there would be.
Some of the things that came up a lot, I think, was there's a lot of people in the chat that say that they are not able to see their earnings calculation in CPARIS. So can you guys go over why that may be happening?
Sure. So as you're submitting your report, your fiscal analyst is reviewing those reports for accuracy, just to ensure that they don't have any questions about the data that was submitted, because of course the data that's submitted in those reports will directly result in your contract earnings calculations being projected and your apportionment payments being calculated. So you will not be able to immediately see your earnings calculations upon certifying a report. Your analyst needs to review that report first and approve that actual calculation. And then once they approve that calculation, then that will become a viewable link for you on the screen that Danny showed earlier. We are working on, one of the things that we're working on as far as development of the system goes, is we are working on system notifications. That's something that is, we're very aware is a needed thing, especially with this. So at this time, you can log into CPARIS at any time and take a look and see if they're there. You can contact your fiscal analyst until we actually get the notifications built in. Unfortunately, we don't have any way of letting you know that the analyst has approved those calculations, but that is the trigger event for them to be viewable to you.
So I'm going to further that, because there was another question that I responded to, was how long should it be, or should it take for the earnings calculation to be viewable in CPARIS? And this was specific to a revised report, but I think it is the response for any report, I guess. So it really just depends on when your fiscal analyst does approve the report. As Kate said, we currently don't have a notification system within CPARIS. So especially with a revised report, if you submit a revision, you'll need to contact your fiscal analyst, because they don't know that a report has been submitted, a revised report has been submitted. All of our fiscal analysts on like the quarterly and monthly deadlines know that after the 20th of the month, that they should be going into the system and looking. And so if it's a normal report, you probably should see it within a few weeks. But if it's a revision or a report that was submitted like outside of those timeframes, those normal timeframes, you'll want to just reach out to your fiscal analyst. So I know that I did see a lot of other things about like the print to PDF, and people would really like that, you know, so that it's one concise report that they can save. Those, in my mind, are system upgrades. And at this point in time, what we're trying to do is build out the CPARIS system. So we have a very old system that we use internally that has never been visible to the field. That is aging, you know, it's surviving, but on its last leg. And so what we're really trying to do with CPARIS is build out the functionality first, and then things like system upgrades or notifications, those are enhancements that we will try to fit in here and there, but really the goal is to get the system fully up and running. So that is our priority at this point in time. Other than that, there have been a bunch of questions, Kate, but I just can't pull out some that are ones that have been repeat questions. I don't see any repeat questions. So I think we're good there. We are still trying to respond to questions via the Q&A though, so anyone can look at the responses.
All right, so before we close, I'd like to take a moment to go over the resources available to contractors. So first, the CPARIS user manual. The user manual is in the process of being updated to add a section related to the contract earnings calculation I just reviewed today. And we expect that the updated manual will be posted in the coming weeks. I did see that question in one of the Q&A. So also the frequently asked questions document can help you navigate common issues such as password reset. And both of those documents can be found on the CPARIS homepage once you've logged in underneath the announcements section. We also did drop the frequently asked questions link in the chat earlier, but we can drop that in again if that would be helpful. The ENFS Fiscal Handbook, recently updated and posted for the fiscal year 22-23 fiscal year, is an invaluable resource for contractors. So if you need to reach your fiscal analyst, but you're not sure who they are or how to get hold of them, you can refer to the directory. And all of these documents and more can be found on the ENFS webpage at https://www.cde.ca.gov/FG/AA/CD. And I do also want to say too that the example that we went over today was meant to be helpful for agencies as you're navigating this. And this is fairly similar to the PDF calculation worksheet that you're used to receiving from your analyst. The biggest differences, of course, are that we are displaying the contract earnings calculations by county. So that is a feature that was not available to you in that PDF that you used to receive from your analyst, as well as the exceptional needs severely disabled set aside exemption credit was not viewable either. So if you have specific questions relating to the earnings of your contract, I definitely recommend reaching out to your fiscal analyst. And we tried to make the contract earnings as accessible and easily understood as possible. And so you'll see on the screen that I went over, and as you go into your specific earnings calculation for your contract, that we have a display explaining underneath each section what exactly the line is doing. And if there is a formula, it displays the formula as well. So the intent of that was to try to make this as transparent as possible and easily understood for you. But again, your fiscal analysts are always available to answer technical assistance questions that you may have and any questions that specifically relate to your contract. I'm just looking here to see if there's any questions that we want to answer live. So I see a question here. If an intra-agency transfer to a CSPP contract is completed, does this increase the exceptional needs severely disabled set aside? And no, that does not. And that is the purpose of that line that you would see towards the top of the calculation. That is the VTT and CSPP CCTR transfer exception. So I went over that earlier in the webinar, and the purpose of that line is to prevent both the preschool reserve transfer or the preschool reserve cap being increased or decreased based on participating in a transfer, as well as increase or decreasing that set aside amount. So that is the purpose of that line. And you'll see that towards the top of the contract earnings calculation for your contract. That is the purpose of that line there. So if you see an amount there, then that means that you did participate in one or both of those. And that is what that calculation is doing, is preventing the set aside amount from being increased or decreased. And I see another question about whether or not this recording is going to be available. Our plan is we are hoping to get this recording up in the coming weeks, and we are going to be posting that on the ENFS webpage. So when you go to that ENFS webpage, which is the one that I just called out in the previous slide, that will take you to a landing page where you can find information, not just for CPARIS, but information overall for CSPP contractors. So you'll see a section that specifically relates to CPARIS when you go to that page, and I'll go ahead and read that link out again. That's https://www.cde.ca.gov/FG/AA/CD. And again, that takes you directly to the page where you can find the link to CPARIS. You can find the link to the user manual, as well as the fiscal handbook, which has a lot of commonly asked questions that you guys can find answers to. We are not planning on posting a copy of the slides. We will be posting a copy of the recording of this webinar. And Corey touched on it earlier in the presentation, but because of accessibility, we did use a lot of pictures on the slides. And so unfortunately, we cannot post a copy of the slides themselves. I see a question here about the user management tab in CPARIS. So if you are logged into CPARIS and you don't see the user management tab, what that means is that you do not have the role of agency admin assigned to you. In order to be able to view the user management tab, you must have that role of agency admin. And so the primary purpose of the agency admin user, as Danny went over earlier, is to manage users at your agency. So if you're not sure who your agency admin user is, we do recommend having more than one, but at least one. If you're not sure who that is, then you can reach out to CPARIS support via email. That's cparissupport@cde.ca.gov, or you can go to your fiscal analyst and they would be able to view that for you and tell you who your agency admin user or users are. I see a question about the apportionment schedule percentage. That is also available in the fiscal handbook. And I saw a question about asking for this link to the chat for the web page. So let me just go ahead and copy this in the chat for everyone really quickly.
Hey, also, I want to just keep it open, the webinar open just a little bit longer because we still are getting questions, but just for like 5-10 minutes.
Okay. All right, so we will continue to answer questions in the Q&A, but we want to just close out by saying thank you for the tireless dedication and commitment to doing your best to the team that has put countless hours into the building of this system. And to all of our state preschool programs, we sincerely hope you found this webinar helpful. And as a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be posted to the ENFS webpage in the coming weeks. So we will go ahead and go silent, but we will continue answering questions in the Q&A. And thank you again very much for joining us today.